let's kick it off. So here's the agenda that we're going to talk a little bit about today. Brandon's going to give us kind of a forward here and some high-level takeaways, and then we're going to jump into the report itself, where we're going to talk about some of the laws in Montana, the number of Montanans that were affected by cyber breaches, and look at it year over year, the average length of those breaches, the number of organizations, and then we'll wrap up by looking ahead, and Sophos will kind of put a wrap on it at the end. Happy to answer any questions as they come forward throughout the webinar, so don't hesitate to send those in. But now I'll hand it off to Brandon for a little bit of an intro.
Let me get off mute. Thanks, Chase. Yeah, so basically I just kind of always like to start any presentation we do with kind of a why statement. Why are we here? What's the purpose of this? And well, one, I think we're all here, and the great audience that we have. I'd like to thank Jace for putting this together. I think this is our third year doing this, and his presentation and the data he's pulling and what we're extracting from it keeps getting better and better. So kudos to you, Jace, for doing that. And thanks to the High Tech Business Alliance. I think we have a great audience today because of their, sharing the message that we have. And I think we've been a partner for at least 5 years with the High Tech Business Alliance. And so thank you to you guys for adding value to all of us. And that's what we're going to try to do today, is add some value back to the group. And those of you that aren't part of the Business Alliance, that's great as well. We're just here to add some value, and hopefully we create some conversations with you and your organizations and your peers, and see if we can all get better because of it. So, the main points I have is we want to raise awareness with data. So we've been doing cybersecurity type of conversations for a long time. We've got better and better every year. I noticed the very first one I ever did, all I did is just scare everybody. I just scared them with a ton of things that we're seeing, and I really didn't give them much from a data perspective or really any kind of guidance of where to go. So that's a big thing for me, is I want to raise awareness, and I want to raise awareness with data. I want to learn from each other. We don't claim to know everything in IT, everything in cybersecurity. It's an ever-changing battle, we're facing those same battles with you. So we want to learn from each other, learn what some of you are doing, some successes, some failures, and just be stronger together. And then the other thing is just brainstorm some resolution strategies. So that's another thing that we've learned over the years of doing these presentations. It's one thing to scare and give a bunch of information, show how complex this problem is, but we realize we need to give some ideas of what we can do. What could you leave here with that you could take on your own in your own organization, or you could reach out to a company like ours to help you out to solve the problems. Go ahead, next slide, Jace. So this is just a quick slide, and then I'm done, which is good for everybody, about who Pinecove is. So we've been in business for 28 years. We've evolved as the IT industry has evolved. As you can see, we're spread out across the region, and currently we support about 25,000 users a day across a lot of different verticals and a lot of different sizes. So we've just seen a lot of things. We don't know all the answers, but we got our butts kicked a lot in the IT industry. So we have a lot of experience of some things to do and some things not to do. And then just some of our solutions and kind of who we are is we really try to fill in the gaps for the underserved organizations. And that really started very simple. And we got our start in the public sector arena, schools, municipalities, where IT staffs are not robust. But one thing we found is, as cybersecurity threats have evolved and just IT has evolved, we're all underserved. I mean, I doubt if you asked yourself, do you feel like you're, fully, you have a staff that can handle the day-to-day battles of cybersecurity or IT? We all could use more help. And so what we found is the verticals and the sizes that we've grown into has grown because we're all in this battle together of not having enough resources to battle the things that we're seeing day in and day out. So you can see from our services, obviously we provide different solutions, and really how you can think of us is we don't develop anything. We go out and try to find the best solutions out in the industry and bring those to our customers. So whether that's in the cybersecurity field, infrastructure, wired and wireless networks, communication, physical security, just all the different things that go into an IT portfolio. We try to come in as a consultant to our customers and provide some experience and some recommendations. So that's us, and we'd love to talk further with anyone. We have some action items at the end that certainly we can jump in and add some additional value to your organizations. But that's it for me, and I'll kick it back over to Jace.
All right, thanks, Brandon. Okay, let's dive in. So before I dive into some of the numbers that we're going to talk about, I just wanted to share my email address there. We've been expanding this report for the last 3 years. It's gotten better, more information every year. And we have some plans for next year's as well, but we would love feedback here. We're blessed to have some data to look upon. Most of the data that you're looking at when it comes to national reports and things like that are based off of surveys. This is concrete data that's actually reported to the Montana Department of Justice. And so we're kind of blessed to have this and have some takeaways on a yearly basis. But as we kind of go through the data, if you have any thoughts or ideas on things you'd like to see in the future, feel free to email me or contact us through our website. Love to brainstorm or collaborate with anyone out there that has ideas on this. Having said that, let's jump in. So let's take a look at, well, why do we have this data? It goes back to 2015 when Montana implemented a law requiring all organizations to report data breaches to the Office of Consumer Protection. And then this information is shared and available on the Montana Department of Justice website. So if you download the Montana Cybersecurity Report, link is in the chat, you can actually, there's a hyperlink to where we get this information from. So if you do want to do some of your own exploring into that data, you can definitely do that on the, pulling that data from the Montana Department of Justice website. So some of the things they're required to report include a copy of the consumer notifications they sent to anyone that was affected. They report the number of Montanans that were affected. There's no lower limit. So if even one Montanan is affected, they have to report it to the Montana Department of Justice. They also report when the breach started and ended, and the length of the breach, and their organization name. I think that's pretty much it. So that's the data that we use to pull this report from. A few notes about it before we dive in. So the first one is that the information isn't necessarily comprehensive. So it's not a significant number of organizations, but we do see it. Some organizations will say, well, I know Montanans were affected, but I don't know how many. So how do we analyze that data? It could be one Montanan, it could be 1,000 or hundreds of thousands of Montanans. So what we do when we come across that when analyzing the data is we just count that as one Montanan. So it's the best we can do. We don't want to inflate the numbers at all, but keep that in mind as well. Like I said, it doesn't happen a lot, but it's worth noting. The second point here is this information is only as accurate as it's reported to the Montana Department of Justice. So it kind of leaves you to wonder how many organizations don't report that. Sure, there's a law out there that requires them to, but how many fall through the cracks and don't report? I'm not sure, but just kind of something to consider as well. And then the start and end date, the start date of the breach and the end date of the breach have to be reported, but often it's estimated. So not perfect information, but it's the best that we have, and it's still valuable, as you'll see in a little bit when we go over it. And then throughout this presentation, we'll look at year-over-year graphs comparing some of the numbers and the change year over year. Well, this law went into effect mid-2015, and I think they started publishing the results of different breaches in, I think, August of 2015. So we've included 2015 on the different year-over-year graphs we're going to talk about, but it's not going to be comprehensive of the whole year, so keep that in mind as well. Chat section. So someone's asking for a link to the report. So if you go to our website, pinecc.com, it's under resources. We'll also send out a link to it after the webinar is over, if you don't see the chat section there. All right, next slide. So before we dive into the numbers, one other note here is the state in 2019 invested in a project they have going on called the Montana Cybersecurity Enhancement Project. So I think between 2019 and 2023, they're spending $6.3 million to improve the state's cybersecurity protection, which is interesting, right? As businesses that operate in the state, it kind of makes you raise your eyebrows a little bit. Well, if the state is investing that much money into improving its security posture, maybe we need to look at it as well. You can see here, this quote on the second bullet point is pulled directly from the piece of legislation where they're restricting the expenditures of that $6.3 million to everything in that list. So next generation antivirus, staff, student programs, firewalls, email, threat monitoring, compliance software, etc. So they're doing some significant audits and improvements of their cybersecurity posture, which I think is something that's worth noting. And I think that they're setting a good example here that threats are evolving pretty significantly, and it's time that we need to evolve our security as well. So this will, it's hard to find, we'll continue to research and monitor those expenditures as they go through and try to report on some of them through our blog at pinecc.com. But it's clear that they have realized it's a priority, and it's a good thing that they have, because we could pull up dozens of government entities that have suffered breaches in the last few years. So there's that note. And with that, let's dive into the numbers that we're seeing this year. So in 2020, we're starting off on kind of a good note, but good is pretty relative in this situation. A total of 82,531 Montanans fell victim to a data breach in 2020. That may not seem like a good thing, and to be honest, it's not really. But if you look at it relatively to the previous year, in 2019, where there was 233,500 Montanans that fell victim to a breach, right? It looks a little bit better. So there's a few notes here, though. We're going to talk about this in one of our future slides, but although the number 82,000 is significantly lower than in 2019, in both 2019 and 2018, we saw a few outliers of massive cyber breaches that kind of bolstered the numbers there. So we're going to kind of make note of that as well. But I suppose it's worth, it's better to be 82,000 than up around where we were last year. So that's some good information. When you're looking at the numbers in more detail, there was one major breach in 2020 that affected 32,000 Montanans. And then there were, everything else was more of a smaller breach, not affecting, when I say smaller, I mean not affecting such a great number of Montanans. But we're seeing kind of it more spread out across a larger number of organizations, which we'll talk about in a future slide, and you'll be able to see what that looks like. But let's talk about this largest data breach. It's not often we get to understand what these breaches are. Is it what variant of cyber attack is it, and how did it operate? We don't really get that information, but with this one we did. So this was the largest breach that affected the greatest number of Montanans in 2020, happened to Morgan Stanley. It affected 32,370 Montanans, so over a third of the total number of Montanans affected in 2020. And it's a crazy story. We have this information because of a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit that's pending. So some of this information has become public. But basically, the social security number, the account numbers, the passport number, contact information, date of birth, asset value of the holder, and all the holdings data were all leaked for all those Montanans. And we don't know how much that is nationwide, but for one breach affecting 32,000 in Montana alone, you got to think it's pretty significant nationwide or even globally. So kind of a scary attack here that we saw. As I mentioned, there's a class action lawsuit pending. And so it's good that we kind of get this story, because we don't get a report on too many stories of how it happens. But basically what happened with this breach was Morgan Stanley was shutting down 2 of their data centers. They hired a vendor to remove all of their customers' data from the equipment. They learned that the data was not fully wiped clean by that third-party vendor. So my gut reaction was, well, maybe Morgan Stanley doesn't deserve all the flack from this breach. But then you kind of read a little bit further, and not the data that was on their equipment was unencrypted as well. So, a little bit of negligence there maybe. So basically what happened is they had shutting down the data centers. The third party didn't wipe all the data. So how did it fall into the bad hands? Well, we don't really know, but Morgan Stanley has said, quote, the equipment is missing. So that equipment that didn't get wiped fully clean and wasn't encrypted, it went missing, and it's now been leaked. And the equipment and servers has now, the data on it has unauthorized third-party users that have access to that data, which they can use to steal identities, make fraudulent purchases, and among other things as well. So it's a bummer that happened for sure. Affected a large number of Montanans, and we don't know how many people were affected nationwide or globally, but a significant attack there. Before I talk about the year-over-year statistics, I thought I'd share some data that I found as well. So what do they do with this data? Well, according to Forbes and Statista, we have an idea of the market rate for some of these line items of customer data. So this varies significantly, right? If you have the account number of someone that has more money in their account, that account number is much more, is worth a lot more than someone who doesn't have a lot of money in their account. So this varies, but this is kind of the averages that we saw from those two articles. So for account numbers alone, their going rate is about $259.56 on average. Social Security numbers are going for about $4 a pop. And then the passport information is $18.45 per passport. If you can get a hard copy of a passport, it's like $1,000, but for just the information, you get about 18 and a half. Interestingly, Social Security numbers used to be worth a lot more money, but which I kind of raised my eyebrows at that when I saw that number, only $4, but apparently when the Equifax breach happened in 2018, it flooded the market with Social Security numbers, and so they're just not worth as much today as they used to be. But anyway, looking at the account numbers, the Social Security number, the passport information, those were all part of the Morgan Stanley breach. So if you kind of break that out and just assume on average they made $282 per person, well, the hackers that were able to exploit those Montana's information made over $9 million just from the Montana information they were able to gather. So quite a payday for them, and that's Montana only. Like I said, we don't know what that looks like nationwide or globally. So there's a market out there for sure for this information, and it's kind of scary, but we have to talk about it. You have to stay educated on the threats, and we don't like to scare people into cybersecurity or anything, but the facts are the facts, right? So we're just reporting on the facts. Let's look at it year over year now. So before I do that, let's cumulatively, since this information has become public in 2015, 899,000 Montanans have been affected by a cyber breach, and that can range from email and password getting leaked to some of the information we saw in the Morgan Stanley breach of Social Security numbers and bank accounts, etc. So if you were to assume that each one of the Montanans affected was a unique individual, which obviously that's not true, but for the sake of a hypothetical, if you do assume that each one is unique, that would mean that 89.4% of all Montanans have fallen victim to a data breach in the last 6 years, which is just crazy. It's kind of mind-boggling. So looking at the graph there, 2020 looks pretty good, but I put some numbers there at the bottom. There was a Montana hospital system in 2019. So in 2019, we're looking at about 230,000, I think it was, overall, and 126,000 of those came from one breach in to a hospital system in Northwest Montana. So a bit of an outlier there. And then in 2018, we have Equifax. So even though we're looking at, I think it was about 420 or 30,000 Montanans affected that year, 377,000 of them came from that one Equifax breach. So there are some outliers there that kind of skew the data to maybe make 2020 look better than it actually was. But overall, we're going to take the little victories that we can here and be happy that that we have the numbers that we did this past year in 2020. I see some questions coming in. I'm going to get to those after I present the data, if that's all right. I just think it'll be easier that way. So yeah, I think that in 2019 and 2018, we saw some numbers that negatively skewed the data, but it is what it is, right? So that's what we're seeing. Now we're going to look at the length of cyber breaches. So this is an interesting thing to think about because I had never really thought about the length of a cyber breach ever. I kind of just, I don't come from a tech background, but I just kind of assumed that organizations would get into your network and then get what they want and leave. But that was naive of me to think, and the data is also confirming that. So in 2020, the average number of days an organization suffered a cyber attack was 77 days. So from the time that the bad actor penetrated their network to the time they were eradicated from their network, on average was 77 days. That average is down from 116 days in 2019 and 93 days in 2018. But the longest data breach ever reported in the, 5 years now we have this data, came in 2020, and I'll talk about that on the next slide here as well. So it's good to see, initially it's good to see that the number is decreasing, but it also seems a little naive to applaud that the number's at 77 days on average. Obviously that a bad actor can do a lot of damage in a few hours, let alone 77 days within your network. So like I said, I think this is an important thing to talk about, something we don't talk about a lot in cybersecurity, in my opinion. But you got to think about, even if you have all the protection to protect your organization from getting hit by a cyber attack, you probably should have a plan for if it does happen, and so you can remediate it and get it out of your network as fast as you can as well.
Jason, I might add something there.
Sure.
So, I think we hear it a lot when we talk to organizations of, hey, knock on wood, thank goodness we haven't been hit yet. And the problem is, that's great if that's true, but how do you know? And I think, a lot of us are very, very familiar with ransomware at this point, where it's very cause and effect. It's in your face. They want you to know, and they want something in return. But these more of, intricate kind of attacks where they're just going to get into an entry point and work horizontally and start doing a number of different things. An example that we see a lot is in the title industry, and probably many of you have seen an example of this, or you've maybe seen your title or real estate companies kind of bolster up how they do these things. But they'll get in and just start learning how a user is interacting with their clients, and so they'll obviously steal email signatures and all those things to become that person, but also just send out information, looking at calendar appointments and saying, oh, I have a closing at 1 p.m. today. 15 minutes before that closing, I'm going to email that customer as you and say, we've changed how we're going to close, and we're going to move this to a wire, and we need you to wire, $300,000 to this account. And so that's where these long-term type of breaches, they're just building more and more things they can do. One, it's extracting data. They'll stay in there and extract all kinds of personal information as they can. But the other ones are just trying to become you as either the operator in the organization or the key stakeholder that they can take advantage of. So there's really two ways this can happen. Some are very in your face, like a ransomware. Others are very discreet and want to be hidden and want to make very little noise. And I think the Sophos crew will talk more in depth with that. But that's just kind of more of the details of why these are happening for such a long period of time.
Thanks, Brandon. While you were saying that, I was able to look at some of the questions, so I'll answer to a few of them right now. Cheryl, you asked, you said you download the form, but you weren't able to get a direct link to it. I'll send everyone a direct link to the report, so you don't need, if you are having trouble accessing the report, I'll send a direct link to the report itself following the webinar in the next day or two. And then Jenny asked, how long does it take to have the information about all the 2020 breaches? Well, we kind of scrape that data from the website. So if you download the report, you'll see a hyperlink to where we get the data from, and then we kind of scrape it and compile it. So hopefully that answers those questions. Keep them coming if you have any more. I think there was another one that said, has the cyber threat increased with more people working from home? Eric and Anthony, I'm gonna have you answer that once we get to your portion of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the end of my presentation, but maybe it's something you can touch on as well when you have your time towards the end. Keep the questions coming if you have any more. Happy to answer them. Going back to this, so looking at the length of the cyber breaches through the years. So hard to, there's not much of a trend line there. Also, keep in mind, like I said at the beginning, the 2015 data is incomplete. I put it on there because we have the data, but it's only for, I think, a third of the whole year. So, take that with a grain of salt. But, the trend line maybe is going up a little. There was a really bad year in 2017. Lucky to see that number come down a little bit in 2020. So, looking at the data from 2020, though, 31% of the attacks lasted one day. The other 69% of the attacks lasted more than one day. So, more than, about 2/3 of the time, maybe a little more, we're seeing the attacks happen where it's not just in and out of the network, it's lingering around for several days or years, unfortunately. And then I said this in a previous slide, but the longest ever reported data breach in all the Montana data we have that we scour through was reported in 2020. And the start date was in 1995. The end date of the breach was in 2020. It was a 25-year-long cyber attack where they had bad actors within their network. And this wasn't a Montana-based company. It was a California law firm, I believe. But, those Californians getting us again. But it did affect, I can't remember how many Montanans, but a lot of Montanans. And obviously, they had a bad actor in their network for 25 years. There's a lot of damage that can be done there. It's kind of eye-opening, crazy. Looking at the organizations that were affected by breaches in 2020, I feel like our graphs have been pretty good up to this point, but this one's not going to be very pretty. Record 684 organizations fell victim to a cyber attack in 2020 that affected at least one Montanan. This is up more than 150 from 2019, where there was 514 total. I mean, when you're looking at a list of 684 organizations, you can find a company from every single vertical in it, basically. But when filtering by the attacks that affected the largest number of Montanans, we saw the industries of CPAs, retail stores, law firms, tech firms, consultants, as kind of being some that kind of stuck out to us as being the most affected. But like I said, it's not like they're targeting one industry in particular. We're seeing it across every industry. Those are just some of the ones that stuck out as in the larger breaches. The two largest breaches that happened in Montana, two Montana organizations, happened in Ravalli and Missoula counties and affected about 4,000 Montanans total between the two of them. And, we talk about like Morgan Stanley, and there's like 32,000 Montanans affected. But overall, there was 82,000 Montanans affected in 2020, and across 684 organizations. Average that out, it's not a significant number of Montanans, but it doesn't take a significant number of Montanans per data breach to do some serious damage. And we saw that with some of the information about what those different data points are selling for earlier. So looking at this year over year, 33.1% increase when you compare 2020 to 2019, and 66% increase comparing 2020 to 2018. So not the trend we want to see here, but there's a few takeaways I'd like to kind of point out. First of all, CNBC reports that when an organization faces a data breach, on average, it costs $200,000. That average obviously varies significantly. But even that number doesn't account for things like shutting down, if you have to shut down for remediation, the cost of your lost data, and if you need to restore that, and then kind of something that's more invaluable to calculate your reputation damage that can come as a result of that as well. So another takeaway for me is rural states are not exempt. You know, we've heard this before. We work in Montana with a lot of organizations. We're based in Montana. And sometimes organizations like to balance and, you know, the risk of getting attacked with the protection itself. And we've heard the thought before that, well, I'm in Montana, so it's less likely to happen to me. Well, that's just simply not true. And the data is showing that to back that up, that that's not true. Montana organizations are getting hit just as much as anywhere else. So rural states are not exempt from this at all. If you're not in Montana and you're on this webinar and you're in one of the rural states that we work in as well, you know, it applies to what you've got going on too in your state. Next slide. Looking at this year over year, like I said, the trend line here is ugly compared to the other graphs. There was maybe some reason we could be a little bit optimistic, but this one doesn't leave much room for optimism. We've seen a steady increase year over year on the number of organizations that fall victim to cyber attacks. I kind of touched on that jump already, but we're looking at 412 in 2018, 514 in 2019, and now 684 in 2020. So not too great numbers there. But what we're seeing, and I think people who are staying educated on cyber threats and you know, following the news around it and things like that, are seeing that hackers are starting to evolve. They're using more sophisticated tactics than they have before, and organizations in many instances are lagging behind that evolution and still relying on outdated, you know, maybe they're just relying on outdated endpoint security as the end all be all. It's still necessary, but it's not going to compete with the tactics the hackers are using today. And I don't say that as a way to scare people into anything. I just say it as it's the truth that what we're seeing, and organizations need to kind of evaluate their cybersecurity posture and relate that to the threats we're seeing today from the bad actors, and how do they compare, and how can we maintain a security posture that's going to protect us against those evolving threats. So let's talk about, we're going to leave the numbers now because that's pretty much all the numbers we have. Like I said, in the next year, we're going to be kind of diving in a little bit more into some more numbers, but you can review all these numbers, and the graphs and everything are in the report, which we'll send out a direct link to. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we see as threats coming up in 2021 as the next slide. So we continue to expect familiar threats to come through, you know, things like ransomware, but we also expect to see new threats as well. Some of the specific things we wanted to highlight, well, there's 3 specific things we wanted to highlight. The first being ransomware. I don't think you can really produce a truly factual cybersecurity report without talking about it. Ransomware was a significant tactic used in 2020. We especially saw it in the healthcare industry and in education. It's going to continue to be prevalent. It's not going anywhere. The remote working concerns. So, you know, previously you maybe had one network. You had kind of this bubble you could form around your office or within your network, and maybe you didn't, because this has been kind of an ongoing thing, right? COVID ushered it, but people have been working from home before that. But now you kind of have to expand the perimeter of your security network into every home that you have an employee as well. So it presents some unique challenges as more and more people are working remotely. And then the last one being non-traditional threats. So we don't talk about this a lot because this is more on the consumer level, but now that people are working from home, it probably does affect more companies, but you see users are quick to embrace some of this new technologies, things like smart TVs or cameras or doorbells or appliances. Although they're not traditional computing devices, they still can provide access to the network, and if they're not secured properly. So those are three things we're seeing. We could probably talk for forever about all the different things we could see, and even if we were to talk forever about it, I'm not sure we would cover it all, as there's going to be things that we can't predict, or new variants of cybersecurity threats that we just don't know exist yet. So those are three we wanted to highlight specifically that we think are going to be prevalent here in 2021, though. And then this is my last slide. So before I hand it off to Sophos, what are some security measures that we can think about for 2021? Well, attention to detail is the first one. So in 2020, we saw a lot of cyber attacks that were a result of negligence on the organization's part. So they might have the latest and greatest next gen, all the fancy buzzwords, technology, cybersecurity, but if you don't maintain basic hygiene, then it's not going to do what it's designed to do. So make sure you pay close attention to your products, make sure everything's up to date and patched properly and installed where it needs to be installed. The second point was we need to prioritize education. So it's hard to understand the threats if you're not educated on the threats. So we try to do that at Pinecove. We try to send out a newsletter. We post on our blog what we're seeing. But I would recommend, kind of building a list of different resources you can use as you try to stay up to date on the threats and the different solutions as well, because we hear a lot about the threats. It's maybe not as fun to hear about the solutions because they're kind of, vendors might be like more product pushing, and that may turn you off a little bit. We try not to do that here at Pinecove, but it's important to stay up to date both on the threats and the evolution of the security aspects of the network and things like that as well. Then the last point is, let's have a plan. So we get approached by organizations that face cyber attacks. We can mobilize and try to remediate that threat the best we can. But oftentimes people are scrambling, and most times you are, because how can you prepare against it? But there are certain things you can do to prepare against it, and that's what we're kind of talking about here. Who do you need to call to begin remediation? What does that look like? What measures in place do you have to restore the data? You hope for the best, but we got to be prepared for the worst. So having a plan would be kind of the last bullet point here of things to prepare for in 2021. There's obviously much more we could talk about, but those are kind of what we identified as three of the big takeaways. And with that, that's all I have. Feel free to chat any more questions that come in. If any more come in, I'm happy to jump on and answer them. In the meantime, I'll hand it over to Sophos. We're lucky to be joined by Eric and Anthony from Sophos. They are our cybersecurity partner. We've been partnered with them for a long time. We are the highest partner that anyone can achieve with them. We're a platinum partner, which basically means that we know the technology, we've been certified in it, and we've sold a lot of it. And Anthony and Eric are going to talk to us about what they're seeing on a global scale and share some statistics on that as well. So Anthony, I'll go ahead and give you presenter abilities.
Thanks, Jace. We're just going to get Anthony to share his screen here. And I think it'll be a nice complement to what you just shared with the laser focus on the backyard here in Montana, where Sophos will give you more of a global purview into what we're seeing with the same type of threat data. And Anthony is our engineer that covers the Rocky Mountain territory, is dedicated to supporting both the Pinecove partnership as well as our customers in Montana. And Anthony, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very, very much. G'day all. As mentioned, I'm going to cover and just go over what Sophos is seeing as a whole globally and get that sort of purview, right? So we've got that detailed and kind of that view of what's happening directly and specifically in Montana and what's affecting you every single day in your areas, in your environments. And so now I'm going to cover what we have seen globally and kind of give you some of the statistics that we've seen in a report that we actually created called The State of Ransomware. Now, in this report, Sophos, we commissioned an independent research house, Benson Bourne, to survey 5,000 respondents across 26 different countries and 6 different continents. Now, this sponsored report was given to IT managers who have had varying different levels of ransomware experience or contact, and potentially even been lucky enough to maybe even avoid some of that ransomware contact. Now, in saying that, we did not pick those respondents. They were selected not through and from us, and the responses were actually provided anonymously. Now, you'll actually see here, we've got quite the broad spread here, and you can see the number of respondents per country as well. Now, as we come over to here, this is something to note too. We didn't just go after specific sectors. We actually have a wide range of sectors, both public and private, and most likely hitting some of those sectors in which you currently function in. Now, with that, in each country, we actually had respondents. 50% of those respondents came from organizations between 100 and 1,000 employees, while 50% of those respondents also came from organizations that were slightly larger, from that 1,000 to 5,000 employees as well. And that's important to be able to get that understanding of what that spread is, so you can see and get a little bit more of a personal touch on what that actually means to you and your organization. Now, this is actually kind of a shocking result and number, and it goes hand in hand with the information that both Jace presented, as well as the survey that actually happened at the start. Now, the question at the start, the very starting question and poll that Jace put up was regarding your interaction, or if you know anybody who suffered a data breach in 2020, and 77% of you said yes. Okay, so that goes quite closely. My hope is that it wasn't necessarily you specifically, but that you were just aware of it. But based on the number that we see here, 51% of respondents that replied from this 5,000 said that they suffered a ransomware incident. So that would have it to say that probably 1 in 2 of you, or 50%, if not, I mean, I see 77% are at least aware, but there's a good number of you on this line today that have either suffered and or aware of someone that has suffered that data breach. So the big takeaway here is that everyone should be prepared to be hit. Okay, Brandon mentioned that some of those he mentioned the line about it's not going to happen to me, or the bat is coming for someone else, and it's not. It's be prepared to be hit. Okay. So here's actually a frightening thing that the question came up regarding work from home. Now, since COVID, the FBI has actually reported that cybercrime has increased 4 times. So that's just over this last year, it has increased 4 times. Now, you'll notice that size doesn't matter. Okay, so you've probably heard conversations amongst those in the industry that have made statements like, "Oh, we're too small," or "they're not going to come for us. There's bigger fish to fry. There's bigger fish to catch," and all those kind of different comments. Reality has it, this report has uncovered that it's almost an even split between organizations of 100 to 1,000 and 1,000 to 5,000, as we see 47% and 54%, almost an even split right down the center. Absolute evidence to show that size does not matter. There is no catch and release policy as it relates to this big fish and amongst those thieves. Now, according to Coveware, Coveware is a company that negotiates ransomware ransoms across the industry, and they work with customers to negotiate a lower rate or what have you. And according to their CEO stats, in 2019, in the 4th quarter, the average ransomware payment was $84,000. Okay, so if that's not enough already, $84,000 as the average back in 2019, the 4th quarter, that has tripled over the next following 12-month period, up to 230,000. So again, this is just the ransomware payment. Now, Jace touched on and had mentioned that 200,000 as a result of the cost of a breach or what have you. And so, and that's just sort of just that cost of the breach per se, not necessarily, he made reference to not necessarily some of the other facts that are and costs that are associated with that breach. So with that just being the average ransomware payment, you have to factor in things like your actual downtime. So you'll see that here as an average downtime for ransomware was 19 days. Again, that is just that ransomware component and the average being 19 days. So the cost associated with that, the cost associated to restore from backups, right? The cost associated to bring your people and systems back online. Now, a big factor, right? So is needing to take into consideration that total business impact. So it was found that an average cost of a ransomware event is actually something more like $760,000 when you take into account all of those factors, including your brand recognition, like $760,000 to attempt to restore back to a previous state. Now, that is enough to cripple most organizations. Now, if we come over to this stat that I'm showing you now, annually, Verizon actually releases a global data breach report, and the number one source of breach identified by Verizon, was actually hacking. So Jace did mention, made reference to, and actually Brandon also referenced that making that ransomware is not the only thing, right? There are many other different types of malicious actors, malicious payloads, and malicious sophisticated attacks going on. And this report identifies that in their report, that they see that 45% of breaches come through hacking. And as we drill that down just a little bit more, 82%, or over 80% here, but it was like 82% of those cases of hacking actually involved brute force or stolen credentials, the use of stolen credentials. So that is actually quite huge. We're talking about having a human-led attacker breaching or entering into your network and your environment with credentials that are legitimate. Okay, so the way by which they receive those credentials, those compromised credentials, again, lost or stolen, whether it was from a keylogger or whether it was from brute force, at the end of the day, you've got some human-led attacker now, and like Brandon mentioned, in your environment, moving laterally, right, moving east and west, and trying to move from one machine into another, to potentially finding their way to your servers to try and have way with your environment. So I can't talk any more loudly or more prominently about this without making reference to the absolute need for multi-factor authentication. Okay, so you want to front your systems where you can and where possible with two-factor / multi-factor authentication, providing another layer between your credentials and your system, and being able to bring that together with a changing, rolling number or two-factor authentication key, so that even if they had the credentials, it places another layer right in front of that access. So it is so important for you to do all that you can to help thwart these malicious actors from gaining access to your environment.
Thanks, Anthony. And Brandon mentioned earlier, we don't want to just give you the stats about the doom and gloom without suggested next steps. And we wanted to do this in a way that was more agnostic. So this is not a Sophos overview on this particular slide here. What we're trying to do here is give you an idea of industry best practices. And so, look, there's lots of security solutions out there. But when it comes to, well, what should I do about this? And Jace mentioned it earlier, have a plan. There are upgrades needed to keep pace with the evolution of this threat landscape. And I think Anthony outlined it best. The data from the Verizon breach report indicates that you're going to have a human-led attack. If you're breached, the chances are it's going to be a human-led hacker. And in many cases, I find organizations don't have a human-led defense. They're relying exclusively on products. And so what we wanted to do here was give you just some suggestions as you're evaluating your own security posture, what components you might want to consider adding for the future. And these are industry best practices. And certainly we'd like to show you how Sophos can do some of these things, but in general, you can get these from a variety of vendors out there in the marketplace. And Anthony just highlighted the bottom left, authentication. You got to have multi-factor. You're going to get an attacker, and that attacker is going to have your admin credentials. The average price of the admin credentials, apparently, according to Jace's update, is actually cheaper than my passport because those sell for $1.50. The administrator account on your network would sell for $1.50. Hacker buys it, they start attacking you. So MFA, multi-factor authentication, critical. Top left, next gen, and we're talking antivirus and firewalls. So if you're still using legacy antivirus, or you're still using a legacy firewall without next gen capabilities, then functional equivalent to the Transportation Security Administration, TSA security, that's like only having a no-fly list. Okay, and the no-fly list is a good thing. We know that those individuals shouldn't be allowed to fly because we've seen them before. But what about individuals we've never seen before? I mean, we don't want to only rely on the no-fly list, right? So if you're still using legacy signature-based antivirus, or if you still have an old school firewall that's giving you stateful packet inspection without the next gen capabilities, you're running TSA with a no-fly list only. And what you need is the body scanners and the whole deal. Moving on down that path or that line of thinking, you have detection and response capabilities. And so now you get into the fusion of artificial intelligence and machine learning and product, the fusion of the tools and the products with the people and the expertise. And really, you need both. And back to my TSA analogy, sure, they have the metal detectors and whatnot, but they still have a human look at the X-ray inside your bag. They're combining the technology and the human threat expertise. And in this case, that's going to be a detection response tool, either an EDR, which stands for endpoint detection and response, or a new industry term that you'll hear from vendors like Sophos and Palo Alto, and even Cisco is using this sort of talk track is XDR, which is extended detection response. And what you're talking about here is tools that can pull information from both your firewall and your endpoint protection and make it queryable and correlate the alerts and information you're getting so that you're not just having niche products, but you're now correlating the data. And you have a threat expert that has the ability to really hunt and look into suspicious indicators. Because if I have an admin account, I'm supposed to be on your network. And what if I use applications that are supposed to be on your network, like PowerShell? PowerShell could be a perfectly legitimate use case, or it could be a nefarious use case. Now, how do you know? Well, you need a tool, a detection response tool, to allow you to ask the right questions, and you need an expert who's available to use that tool and then make the judgment. Is this benign or is this a malicious use of these tools? And so you got to have a detection response tool. And one other note on detection response tool, and forgive me for yet another airline analogy, but an endpoint detection response tool will also serve the purpose of the black box on the airplane. So if you're unfortunate enough to suffer a breach, without the black box, it's hard to know what caused the crash, right? If you have a detection response tool, it's delivering a data recorder, and the data recorder will allow you to rewind the TiVo, if you will, rewind and see the root cause of the incident. So now you know where to start your cleanup effort and getting that hacker out of your network, removing the backdoor access that they have. And B, you can then follow from that root cause forward to be certain that you've eradicated the threat completely and not just a component of it, because you can follow the trail of breadcrumbs, if you will. If you don't have an endpoint detection response tool in place, and like I said, multiple vendors out there, this is not a Sophos thing, it will have a data recorder. It will allow you to much more quickly and effectively identify the root of your breach and make sure that you're cleaning it up as quickly and efficiently as possible. Without that, you're going to ask basically a digital forensics investigation response team to start combing through logs and try to put the puzzle back together without the picture. And that takes an awful long time, and it's not cheap. Now, the next line down below XDR, it's still a member of the detection response family, if you will. But the problem that I have found, and that I think you will find, is that most organizations, while they may have a good security person or security team even, they may not be available 24/7. Now, Sophos has a rapid response team that gets, the firefighter calls, we've been breached, what do we do right now? And those calls spike Thursday to Sunday because the adversaries, this is a human-led attack, they know they're less likely to get discovered Thursday to Sunday. And so that's when they really go to work and launch the attack. They spend a lot of time staging it. They're on your network for a long time, setting up the attack. And they're not going to launch the attack and make you aware of their presence until they feel they've really got you where they want you. And so a lot of that involves, like, if it were a ransomware attack, they're going to disable your backup, right? Because if you can restore from backup, why would you pay the ransom? So it takes time for them to find the sensitive data, exfiltrate the sensitive data, ensure that your backup is disabled or not available to you, et cetera. And so while all that's happening, that's when these little suspicious indicators will pop up. And they're smart. They're going to evade detection, even if you have a good security tool. These hackers know you're going to have a good security tool. They're going to do their best to evade detection until they want you to know they're there. And so that's why it's so important for you to jump on these suspicious indicators right away using your detection response tool and investigate. And if your staff can't be available 24/7 to do that, then you can outsource to a managed detection response team. And then managed detection response teams, effectively, you just, instead of building your own, staffing your own, retaining your own people, you have a team that's outsourced doing it for you. And then finally, none of these tools are perfect. So you have to have a plan in case you're breached. My kids know where to go if there's a fire in the house. We meet at the neighbor's house across the street, right? Do you have an incident response plan? And so you've got to jump in there and make sure that you are capable of, or have a plan in place and know how long it's going to take to get the firefighters to show up in the event that you do suffer a breach. So those are your industry best practices there. And I'll give it back to Anthony, where we can give you a couple of points on how Sophos does these things. We think maybe just a little bit better. But as we're coming up close to the top of the hour, I do want to throw out there that as an action item, if any of you would like to have a conversation with a Sophos subject matter expert about we have the threat response team, about your current security posture and maybe prioritize potential next steps for 2021 or 2022, that's an offer that Pine Cove and Sophos would like to make as a potential next step. We'd be happy to have that conversation, broker that conversation with our incident response and threat response experts, and you could get maybe some guidance as to what you might do this year and next to increase your own posture. So Anthony, back to you.
Thank you. So just really quick, again, like Eric mentioned, we're at the top of that hour. So at Sophos, we have the world's best endpoint protection, InterceptX. It is providing you with that next gen AV that was talked about with regard to the industry required, with artificial intelligence, deep learning, with anti-exploit, with anti-ransomware, with performing just-in-time copies and automatic rollback of your files in a pre-encrypted state, with cleaning capabilities, and with also threat case and root cause analysis capabilities as well to be able to see what, when, where, and how. Now, as you kind of step over to that middle where it talks about EDR, InterceptX with EDR, that's that tool set that Eric was talking about, giving your IT admins the ability to be able to search, hunt, discover, and remediate. Now, that next step, though, which is actually a crucial step in being able to gain those extra, enhance those skills and capabilities for your IT and security teams. We know that we could always use extra help, and this is where Sophos MTR can come in, and working directly with Pine Cove and potentially even with your teams to be able to automatically and 24/7 threat hunt and remediate any malicious type of activity that we actually see going on in the environment. Now, one of the biggest benefits of everything that I just covered, that is with a single line item, single agent, hands-on keyboard, taking immediate action. And in times like that, those challenging times, speed is absolutely crucial and vital. So, like Eric mentioned, as you want to know more, you want to get in touch with some experts and even in touch with our team. We will happily have those calls, and I'll hand that time back to Jason, to Brandon.
Thanks, Sophos. Appreciate that. I know we're out of time here, people, but if we're going to send the recording to everyone, we're going to send the report to everyone. We'll follow up. But just as we also have a few questions come through, so if you do have time and you want to stick around for that, feel free. Brandon, is there anything you wanted to talk about before we answer maybe the 1 or 2 questions that are left?
I don't think so. I think we get into the questions. I think one of the big takeaways, I think, for the people that are on this call, I think we're probably all here for a reason, because we obviously know we want to learn more about this. We're concerned about it. But I bet there's a lot of you out there thinking, oh man, I wish this person was on this, or how do I get this concern that I have across to the people that need to hear it in my organization? And I think there's some data there that we showed that we are not just the victim, like, okay, there's a big Equifax breach and I am one of the hundreds of thousands that was hit. Our organizations are now the target because we're easier targets. The steps that an Equifax or a Target or a Sony have taken to protect against this, I guarantee you, are far greater than what we've done as our small little CPA shop or as a 25-person IT security company. We don't have the resources or the expertise to be able to do what they've done. And so just like we're telling you the value of outsourcing, we have to outsource. We don't have 24/7 threat hunters sitting in here at Pine Cove addressing these things. We cannot scale that. And I'm doubting the majority of you can scale that either. And so that's a big thing to look at.
Okay.
Go to the questions.
Yeah, sure. So Jenny's still here, so I'll forward her question on, which is 85% of Montana's manufacturers have 20 or fewer employees. Do the statistics hold true for those as well? And maybe I'll just quickly answer that. We don't have the numbers on the breakdown of the cyber attacks by company size. It's something we hope to do in the future, but with the conversations we've had and the experience we've had, I think Brandon can maybe give a little bit of insight into that question, maybe answer it a little bit better than I could.
Yeah, I think we don't have the data, as Jay said, but I can tell you real world. I've been on calls where we've had a 2-person construction company out of Billings basically had a breach that pretty much was close to putting them out of business. 2 people. They had a hole, right? I mean, again, it's not like these attackers are looking at what side you are and then taking the approach. They're putting a lot of fishing poles in the water and lines in the water to see what hits. And when they get one, they want to see how much can they get and what is the value of the target. But it doesn't matter how big or not, they're going to go as far as they can and extract anything they can out of you. So we've seen as small as a 2-person shop give us a call in tears, not knowing if they're going to survive it. We've had I think it was an oil and gas company in eastern Montana give us a call, 20 employees, completely taken over by a South African hacking entity, took over their phones. We're making dial calls out to other potential victims using their 406 phone numbers as the starting point. So again, I think we're going to work and get better at targeting the smaller organization numbers. But I can tell you, we're just as well, maybe even more so, because we haven't taken the proactive approaches that we need to. We are very much in danger of these attacks, similar to these large organizations.
Yeah, to echo that, Brandon, for what it's worth, we often find that the hacker will know that that's an easier path to success, because that, like if you have 1,000 employees, they know that you probably spend some money on cybersecurity and have a security staff. And if you're a smaller organization, they can invest less time, run less risk of having their attack thwarted. They have a much higher conversion rate or success rate, if you will, targeting small businesses. And it may be counterintuitive, but that actually makes the small business target almost more attractive to the adversary, based on what Sophos Labs sees.
Great. Okay. I think that's
good question.
Yeah, I think that's it though. I think there's no other questions. So
Jace, one offer I wanted to make. I was going to show you guys a live example, of some live threat hunts. Like Brandon just gave some really great real world examples. We ran out of time, but if you want to include that in the follow up, I'd be happy to share some links. If anyone would like to read up on some real world attacks and real world threat incident response type scenarios that we didn't have time to cover.
Great. Yeah, we actually just had another question come in. So the question is, could you mitigate attacks by encrypting identifying information? So even if the hacker gets in, they don't actually get the actual data.
Sophos guys, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so Anthony here. So there's absolutely the concept of encrypting at rest as well as obviously in transit, right? So does that make things more difficult? Absolutely. That's if they're taking your data while it is in rest. It all depends on when and where they get in. So in the case where I mentioned with that Verizon data breach report, and they have hands on keyboard, they have credentials, right? So they have some level of administrative credentials, and they're in your environment. They have the keys to the kingdom already, and they're able to see and to get access to whatever systems and traffic. So it all depends. Now, as I said, that's over 80% of breaches that come in with regard to the hacking. Over 80% of those are compromised credentials. So does it help having data encrypted at rest? Absolutely. That helps the whole snatch and grab. That whole helps with the, somebody gets into said system and tries to exfiltrate data. But at the same time, depending on how you have things configured, even though the data may be sitting at encrypted at rest, while said system is accessing said data, then that data is actually unencrypted and accessible. So yes and yes.
Thanks, Anthony. She said it made sense, so there you go.
Wonderful.
Okay, I think we're good. We're going to wrap it up there. We'll be in touch with everyone with some more information, and we will be back next year, January, February, March, somewhere in there, for another presentation of the cybersecurity report for this year. And in the meantime, we will continue to push out a lot of content over email and try to stay in touch and keep some education flowing on the topics we talked about today.